The grease popped when she dropped that first handful of seasoned meat into the skillet. You heard it 2 rooms away. Sizzle, then onions, then a smell that meant 1 pound of beef was about to feed everybody. Here are 30 cheap ground beef recipes black people really ate in the early 1970s. Hamburger steak with onion gravy hit the table more nights than most people want to admit, not because it was boring, but because it worked. You took a pound of ground beef, maybe 59 cents at the A&P in 1970, mixed it with salt, black pepper, a little garlic powder, and shaped thick oval patties with your hands. No egg, no breadcrumbs in the old school version. You seared those patties in a cast iron skillet until the crust turned almost black, then pulled them out and dropped sliced onions into that hot grease. The onions went soft and golden while you stirred in flour, scraping up every bit of foam stuck to the bottom. Water or broth. Went in next, whisked smooth, and the patties came back to simmer until the gravy thickened and the whole kitchen smelled like someone's mama was home. Served over white rice with canned green beans, it fed 5 people for under $2. Your grandmother never measured the flour. She just knew, and nobody who came after her has ever gotten that gravy quite right. The ground beef and rice skillet was a Monday through Friday revelation in black households across Detroit, Chicago, and every city that caught the tail end of the Great Migration. 1 pound of beef, 1 cup of rice, 1 bell pepper, 1 onion, a can of tomatoes, and dinner was done. You browned the meat first, always in the same skillet your mother had seasoned for years, and the grease stayed in because that was the flavor. Onion and pepper went in next, then the rice raw, right into the pan with the tomatoes and enough water to cover. Lid on, 20 minutes, no stirring. You learned the no stirring rule the hard way because lifting that lid let the steam out and left you with crunchy rice and a ruined evening. The rice soaked up everything, and what came out tasted like it took hours. The whole dish ran under $1.50 and left enough for tomorrow's lunch, packed in a Cool Whip container. She started those pinto beans the night before, always the night before. Dried pintos soaked in water on the counter while the house slept, and by morning, they were swollen and ready. A ½ pound of ground beef went in first, browned with onion and garlic, and then the drained beans on top with enough water to cover by 2 inches. Bay leaf, salt pork if she had it. That pot sat on a back burner all afternoon, lid cracked, filling the house with a smell that told every child on the block what was for dinner. Slow cooking legumes with small amounts of meat traces directly to West African one-pot stews, and in the rural South, pinto beans had been stretching, meals since long before emancipation. By the early 1970s, a bag of dried pintos cost 15 cents, the beef about 60, and the whole pot fed 8 with cornbread on the side. You knew they were done when the broth turned creamy on its own, without adding a thing. Smothered cabbage with ground beef was the kind of meal you did not brag about at school, but you ate 2 plates of at home. A head of cabbage cost a dime in 1971, and shredded into a skillet with browned beef, onion, and a splash of vinegar, it became something far bigger than its price. The cabbage wilted down slow, absorbing fat from the meat until every ribbon was soft, faintly sweet, and edged with tang. Seasoned with garlic powder, paprika, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, this dish descended from cooks who understood that cabbage and pork fat had been partners since the plantation garden. 1 skillet, a head of cabbage, a ½ pound of beef, enough for 6. The receipt looked like nothing. The plate looked like everything, and the kitchen carried the smell for hours after the stove went cold. But if those skillet meals told the story of weeknight survival, dirty rice told the story of where those families came from. It started in the bayou parishes of Louisiana, where Creole cooks used chicken livers and gizzards to give white rice its muddy color and deep mineral taste. By the time the recipe traveled north during the migration, many families had swapped organ meats for ground beef. Cheaper, easier to find in urban stores, and far less likely to start arguments with children who refuse liver. You brown the beef in bacon grease with the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper, stirred in garlic, cayenne, and thyme, then folded in cooked white rice. The grains turned gray-brown as they absorbed the drippings, and the whole dish carried a warmth that started at the back of your throat. In New Orleans, old cooks side-eyed any version made without giblets, but in Chicago in '72, ground beef dirty rice was its own tradition. Ground beef chili in a black household was nothing like what showed up at a Texas cook-off. There was no argument about beans. Of course there were beans, because beans stretched the meat, and that was the whole point. You browned the beef with onion and green pepper, stirred in tomato paste, kidney beans, chili powder, cumin, and garlic, then let it simmer until the liquid thickened enough to hold the spoon upright, and you never served it in a bowl by itself. It went over white rice, always rice, because rice was 5 pounds for 60 cents, and it doubled the number of mouths a single pot could feed. Some women added a teaspoon of sugar to soften the acid, a detail you either understood or you did not. By Friday, reheated twice, the flavors fully married, that chili tasted better than it did on Wednesday. It was the kind of dish that improved with patience, the same way the women who made it had improved everything around them through patience alone. The smell of hamburger gravy meant it was the end of the month. You knew before you walked into the kitchen. Flour browning in hot fat, the sharp hit of black pepper, the soft thud of a wooden spoon against cast iron. Your mother browned a ½ pound of ground beef, crumbled it fine, left every drop of grease in the pan, sprinkled flour over the top, and stirred until it turned golden. Milk went in slow, and she kept stirring until the whole thing thickened into a pale brown blanket that clung to the spoon. Poured over split buttermilk biscuits, it was dinner. The dish had roots in the military, where servicemen called it SOS, but in black kitchens, it was simply gravy and biscuits. No pretense, a full meal for 4 people on less than 70 cents. Nobody called it struggle food, not once, because when it was made right, it tasted like being taken care of. And the woman who made it would never tell you she skipped her own plate so there was enough for everyone else. Saturday mornings had their own rhythm, and beef and potato hash was the drumbeat. Somebody was already at the stove cubing cold leftover potatoes into a hot skillet with a little oil. Ground beef went in next, broken apart with a fork until it married with the potatoes. Onion, salt, pepper, a shake of seasoned salt from that red and yellow Laurie's container that never left the counter. You pressed the whole thing flat and let the bottom crust, that was the real secret, the crust, turn dark and crispy before flipping it in rough sections. Fried egg on top if you were lucky, hot sauce if you were smart. The dish stretched back through Southern farmhouse breakfasts where nothing from the night before went to waste, and in a 1970s kitchen, that leftover pipeline was not thrift but art. That specific crunch of cast iron crust is something no restaurant has ever replicated because it required a pan seasoned by decades of meals cooked by someone who is no longer here to season anything at all. There was a certain pride in the way she set those stuffed bell peppers on the table, 4 of them standing upright in a baking dish, tops sliced off like little hats, each one filled with a mound of seasoned beef and rice that rose just above the rim. Ground beef browned with onion and garlic, mixed with cooked rice, a small can of tomato sauce, salt, pepper, and whatever dried herbs lived in the cabinet. Spooned into hollowed peppers, set in a dish with a little water at the bottom, sauce poured over the tops, baked until the peppers softened and the edges charred. Green peppers cost about 5 cents each in 1970, and the whole dish came under $1.50. What made it feel like a real dinner was the presentation. Each person got their own pepper, their own vessel. It turned a cheap Tuesday into something worth sitting down for, and that act of making the ordinary feel special was something she never stopped doing, even when nobody thanked her for it. Long before manwich showed up in a can in 1969, black mothers were making sloppy joes from scratch. Ground beef, tomato paste, ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, vinegar, and Worcestershire sauce cooked down until the mixture went thick and glossy, spooned onto the softest white buns you could find, 19 cents for a pack of 8. It was the kind of meal children measured in stains, sauce on wrists, on shirt fronts, pooling on the plate where you mopped it up with the last scrap of bread. Every woman had her own ratio of sweet to acid, and she guarded it like she guarded her cast iron. The canned version eventually won the convenience war, but it never touched the original. The women who made it from memory never switched over, and when they were gone, their ratios vanished with them. Nobody wrote it down. That was always the problem with the best things from those kitchens. They lived in hands, not on paper. If the skillet meals kept you fed, the stews kept you warm, and when the weather turned cold and the gas bill climbed, ground beef and tomato stew appeared on stoves across every black neighborhood that knew a hard November. Most families never gave it a proper name. They called it stew or soup or whatever's in the pot. Browned beef, diced potatoes, carrots, a can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand, an onion cut rough, and enough water to cover, salt, pepper, garlic powder, bay leaf, and thyme. An hour on low, and the potatoes thickened the broth on their own, the carrots softened, and the tomatoes dissolved until the pot turned deep rust. Families who came north during the migration recognized it immediately. A city grocery adaptation of the vegetable soups their grandmothers made in Mississippi, adjusted for whatever the corner store carried in January. A full pot cost $1 and change, fed 7 people, and reheated even better with cornbread crumbled into the bowl. Salisbury steak carried a quiet dignity in a household where ground beef was the only cut you could afford. You mixed the meat with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, minced onion, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce, then shaped it into thick ovals that looked, if you squinted, like something closer to a real steak. Browned in a skillet until a dark crust formed, set aside while you made the gravy in the same pan. Canned mushrooms, a little butter, flour stirred into the drippings, broth poured slow until the sauce went thick and brown. The patties simmered in it and came to the table over mashed potatoes or egg noodles. Swanson had been selling Salisbury steak in TV dinner trays since the 1950s, but the homemade version was something else entirely. Every mother who made it was taking the cheapest meat in the store and turning it into something that felt earned. The children who ate it never knew the cost until they grew up and tried to make it for their own families, standing alone in a kitchen that used to be full. Tamale pie crossed into black kitchen from the Southwest sometime in the 1960s, carried by a church potluck. Recipes and index cards women traded at work. The filling was ground beef, browned with onion, green pepper, and garlic, stirred with chili powder, cumin, canned tomatoes, and kidney beans until it thickened into something halfway between chili and stew. Poured into a cast iron skillet, then topped with cornbread batter from a box of Jiffy Mix at 12 cents if time was short, and baked until the cornbread puffed golden and the filling bubbled through the cracks at the edges. The dish had been an American casserole since the early 1900s, but by the 70s, it had traveled far from its Tex-Mex origins into neighborhoods that seasoned it differently and used a heavier hand with the pepper. Nobody in those kitchens called it fusion. They called it supper, and the children fought over the corner pieces where the crust met the sauce. Years before Hamburger Helper arrived on grocery shelves in December of 1970, every black mother who stretched a budget already knew the formula: ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, and whatever cheese she could melt into it. The beef went into the skillet first, crumbled and browned with onion and garlic powder. Tomato sauce, a little water, salt, pepper, and the dry macaroni went straight in. No boiling required, because the noodles cooked right there in the sauce and absorbed all that flavor. When the pasta was tender and the liquid reduced to a thick, glossy coating, she stirred in cheddar and put the lid back on just long enough for the cheese to pool. The whole thing took 30 minutes and cost less than $1. Betty Crocker eventually boxed this concept and sold it back to the same women who invented it, and somehow that box became more famous than the hands that never needed instructions. If you have never heard of Porcupine meatballs, you either did not grow up in the 1970s or your family kept its kitchen secrets close. The name came from raw rice mixed into the meatball mixture. It poked out through the surface after cooking, giving each ball a spiny, bristled look that kids found hilarious and adults found clever. You combined ground beef with uncooked white rice, an egg, minced onion, salt, and Worcestershire, rolled them tight, and set them in a baking dish. Canned tomato soup, undiluted, straight from the can, poured over the top. Covered with foil and baked for an hour, the rice swelled as it absorbed the tomato liquid, cooking perfectly inside while the beef stayed moist and tender around it. A can of soup cost 15 cents, a pound of beef 60, dinner for $6 under $1, and every child at the table wanted to know how the rice got inside the meat. Nobody talks about this one anymore, and that is exactly why it belongs here. In a lot of black households, the soup pot held both neck bones and ground beef, not because anyone wrote a recipe that way, but because you used what the butcher had cheap that week. Neck bones cost almost nothing, sometimes 15 cents a pound, and you simmered them first for hours until the marrow melted into the broth and the scraps of meat fell off. Then you browned ground beef separately with onion, added it along with diced potatoes, carrots, canned tomatoes, and whatever greens were wilting in the crisper. The neck bones gave the broth a gelatine richness that plain beef never could, a body that made the soup taste expensive, even though the whole pot ran about $1. You ate it with cornbread and did not ask about the bones at the bottom of the bowl. This soup went quiet when the women who made it did. In the churches, where everybody brought a dish and nobody signed up for the same thing twice, ground beef cornbread pie disappeared first. Seasoned beef, browned with onion, sometimes green pepper, always garlic, spread across the bottom of a greased cast iron skillet, topped with a layer of canned corn, then a blanket of cornbread batter poured right over everything, baked until the top was golden and the edges bubbled where the meat juices seeped through the batter. The women who made it for the repast after a funeral knew it traveled well, held its temperature, and fed mourners without requiring plates that needed washing. A dozen different women could make it, and no two versions tasted alike, which was part of the charm. It cost almost nothing and comforted the way only cornbread and beef together can. Warm without being showy, filling without being fussy. The Biscuit version showed up on the back of the box in the early 1970s, and cheeseburger pie spread through kitchens like a rumor you wanted to be true. You browned the ground beef with onion, spread it in a pie plate, layered sliced tomato and shredded cheddar on top, then poured a batter of biscuit, eggs, and milk over everything. The batter sank around the filling and formed its own crust as it baked. No rolling, no crimping, no pastry skill needed. When it came out puffed and golden, it looked like something a diner would charge $3 for. Some called it impossible pie because they could not believe how simple it was. Others called it cheeseburger pie because it tasted exactly like a burger without the bun. Either way, kids ate every crumb and asked for it again next week, which, in a household where beef had to stretch, was the highest compliment a dish could earn. She made cabbage rolls when she wanted you to know she loved you, but did not have the words. Each leaf was blanched in boiling water until it softened just enough to bend, then laid flat while she spooned a mixture of ground beef, cooked rice, minced onion, and egg into the center. Rolled tight, tucked at the ends, laid seam down in a deep dish, packed close so they held each other upright. Canned tomato sauce was poured over, sometimes with brown sugar and vinegar stirred in, and the whole thing baked low for 90 minutes until the cabbage turned translucent and the filling firmed. The technique arrived in Black Southern cooking through Eastern European neighbors in cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh during the 40s and 50s. By the 70s, the seasoning had been adjusted, more garlic, more pepper, a deeper hand with the spice. The effort was the message. Nobody rolled cabbage leaves on a night they did not care about the people sitting at that table. And if the surprises fed your memory, the next ones fed something deeper. Meatloaf was the dish that separated the cooks from the pretenders. Everybody had a version, but the ones who made it right knew the secrets. Never use lean beef because the fat keeps it moist. Mix with your hands and stop before you overwork it, and always let it rest before cutting. Ground beef, an egg, crushed saltines, diced onion, green pepper, salt, pepper, Worcestershire. Shaped into a loaf on a sheet pan, not a loaf pan, because air circulation gives a better crust. The glaze was the signature, ketchup mixed with brown sugar and a touch of mustard, spread halfway through bacon so it caramelized into a sticky shell. Every family argued about whose mother made the best meatloaf, and nobody ever won because the right answer was always the one who was no longer alive to settle it. Ground beef, goulash, had nothing to do with Hungary, and everyone in the kitchen knew it. The American version, what some called slumgullion or chop suey, was beef, browned with onion and garlic, mixed with elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes and tomato paste, oregano, paprika, a bay leaf, a little sugar. The pasta cooked right in the sauce if you added enough liquid, and the dish came together in one pot in under 40 minutes. In industrial Midwest cities where Black families settled after the second wave of the migration, goulash became a weeknight anchor: a pound of beef, a box of noodles, 2 cans of tomatoes, 8 servings. The kids called it goulash because their mothers called it that, and their mothers used the word because it sounded better than everything in the pot. Slowly, without anyone noticing, goulash vanished from tables, not because anyone stopped wanting it, but because the kitchens emptied out one generation at a time. Shepherd's pie was a Sunday evening dish, the kind that showed up when the big meal happened at noon and the leftovers needed a second life. Mashed potatoes from yesterday got spread, thick over a skillet of ground beef browned with onion, seasoned with salt and garlic powder, mixed with canned peas and carrots, and a quick brown gravy from the pan drippings. Into the oven until the potato crust turned golden and the edges crisped where the gravy bubbled up. English by origin, the dish had been reinterpreted through Southern kitchens where nothing, not the potatoes, not the last cup of frozen peas, not the half pound of thawing beef, was ever wasted. Shepherd's pie gave leftovers a second chance at the table, and in a household that stretched every ingredient twice, that kind of resourcefulness was not frugality but faith, a quiet, stubborn belief that there would always be enough to go around. Beef patties with tomato gravy was the meal that did not need a name because everybody already knew what it was. You shaped ground beef into thin, wide patties, thinner than hamburger steak, almost flat, seasoned with onion powder, garlic, salt, and pepper, then fried them hard in a skillet until both sides developed a dark crust. The patties came out and the gravy went in. A can of tomato sauce poured into the drippings, a little water, a pinch of sugar, flour to thicken. Laid back in the tomato gravy, spooned over, lid on, simmered until the meat softened and the sauce darkened to something close to mahogany. Served over white rice, this showed up 2 or 3 times a month without a single complaint. You had to let those patties sit in hot oil without touching them. And if you never learned that by standing next to someone who already knew, nobody was going to sit you down and explain it. Ground beef and butter beans simmered together the way old arguments do, low, slow, and until everything softened. Butter beans, the large pale limas that Southern families had grown and dried for generations, were soaked overnight and added to a pot with brown beef, a smoked ham hock, diced onion, and enough water to cover. Garlic, black pepper, a bay leaf, sometimes a dried red pepper for heat. 3 hours on the stove while the beans turned creamy and the broth thickened into something that could nearly hold a spoon upright. The ham hock dissolved into threads of smoky pork that tangled with the beef. A pot fed a household for 2 days with cornbread the first night over rice the second, and cost less than the bus fare to the grocery store. Nobody who cooked it right ever rushed it, and neither should you, because that flavor only comes when you finally stop watching the clock. Now the dishes get harder to talk about, not because they were complicated, but because the people who made them are gone. Hamburger stew with drop dumplings was a cold weather meal that took the whole afternoon, and nobody who grew up eating it has found a version that tastes the same. Ground beef, browned with onion, potatoes, and carrots in chunks, canned tomatoes, and water, enough for broth. Seasoned plain, salt, pepper, a bay leaf, because the dumplings were where the richness lived. The dough was flour, baking powder, salt, and milk, mixed until it barely held together and dropped by spoonfuls onto the simmering stew. Lid on, no peeking. 15 minutes, and the dumplings puffed into soft clouds that soaked up broth from the bottom while staying tender on top. Your grandmother told you not to lift the lid. If you listened, they came out perfect. If you did not, they went flat, and she looked at you without a word because the lesson was already clear. Ground beef and okra stewed over rice carried the oldest memory in this entire list. A combination tracing straight to West Africa, where okra was called kingombo and simmered with meat into stews poured over grain. In the American South, that tradition never broke. You sliced okra thin and fried it first in a hot skillet to cut the slime. That was the part you had to know, the frying, because without it, the texture went wrong. Fried okra went into a pot with browned beef, canned tomatoes, onion, garlic, and cayenne, simmered until it broke down just enough to thicken the stew naturally. Over white rice, it connected a kitchen in Memphis in 1973 to a cooking pot in Senegambia 3 centuries earlier. The rice absorbed the tomato broth. The okra held everything together, and the woman standing over that stove knew what she was carrying forward, even if she never named it out loud. The last one is quiet, and it should be. Beef and sweet potato skillet showed up in late October when sweet potatoes came cheap and the air turned sharp. Ground beef browned in cast iron with onion, and while the meat cooked, she peeled and cubed sweet potatoes small enough to soften fast, adding them with a little water, a lid, and patience. The sweet potatoes broke down at the edges, their natural sugar caramelizing against the iron, and the beef fat gave them a savory depth that no amount of butter could match. Salt, pepper, a touch of cinnamon if she felt like it. This was a dish that barely existed outside the kitchens of women who never needed cookbooks, women who tasted with a wooden spoon and adjusted with a wrist, women whose hands moved through a meal the way a musician moves through a song they wrote decades ago. Those hands are still now. The skillet sit cold, but if you close your eyes and breathe in, you can almost smell the sweet potatoes beginning to brown. Corned beef and cabbage with potlikker was a dish that honored the Southern tradition of saving every drop of cooking liquid. After the corned beef was boiled tender, the remaining broth, rich with meat juices, salt, and fat, became precious potlikker, never discarded. Cabbage was simmered directly in this liquid until it absorbed the meaty essence, turning soft and deeply flavored. Families served the cabbage in shallow bowls with the potlikker spooned over top, accompanied by cornbread for dunking. The liquid itself was considered nourishing, often given to children for strength. This practice reflected deep understanding that nutrition existed in every part of the cooking process. Saving and using potlikker was not just frugal, it was wise. The dish carried generations of knowledge.
Okra and ground beef stew was one of the quiet staples your grandparents relied on during weeks when money was thin, but supper still needed to be hearty. The stew began with browning the ground beef, letting onions soften in its juices until they turned clear and fragrant. Then came the sliced okra, fresh from a garden, or traded from a neighbor who always had plenty. Okra thickened the stew as it cooked, turning the broth rich and velvety without needing anything extra. Tomatoes, peppers, and a bit of broth followed, creating a pot that smelled earthy and warm. Some families added corn or lima beans, others tossed in leftover vegetables that needed to be used. As the stew simmered, the flavors blended into something far deeper than the ingredients alone. Your grandparents ladled it into bowls with pride, knowing it was nourishing, comforting, and built to last. Okra and ground beef stew was a reminder of how families thrived through lean seasons with creativity and patience.
Fried corned beef and cabbage patties were one of those clever creations that turned leftovers into something children actually asked for by name. Leftover corned beef was shredded fine and mixed with mashed potatoes, finely chopped cabbage, eggs, and seasoning until it held together in thick patties. These were dredged in flour and fried in bacon grease until golden brown and crispy on both sides while staying soft inside. The patties were served hot with mustard or hot sauce, creating a handheld meal perfect for lunch boxes or quick dinners. Mothers valued these patties because they used up every scrap while creating something new. The crispy exterior gave way to tender, flavorful filling with each bite. These patties proved that economical cooking could be just as delicious as anything bought fresh.
Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a meal your grandparents made when they needed color, warmth, and comfort all in one pot without spending much. It began with ground beef browning in a sturdy skillet, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the sweet peppers, sliced into strips that brightened both the pan and the mood. As they softened, their gentle sweetness blended into the savory beef. A pot of rice cooked quietly on the back burner, fluffy and ready to carry the meal. Once combined, each grain absorbed the seasoned juices and pepper flavor. Your grandparents seasoned it by feel, adding paprika, hot sauce, or broth depending on what the week allowed. Some versions added tomatoes, others kept things simple, but every variation carried the same warmth. Children scraped their plates clean because the dish was hearty without being heavy, and adults loved how far it stretched. Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a reminder that simple ingredients, handled with care, could make a supper feel complete.
Corned beef with creamed cabbage was a dish that brought richness to an otherwise straightforward combination, creating something that felt almost luxurious. The cabbage was shredded and cooked slowly in a mixture of butter, flour, and milk until silky and tender, bathed in velvety cream sauce. Sliced corned beef was arranged on plates with generous spoonfuls of the creamed cabbage alongside. The cream sauce mellowed the cabbage's sharpness, while the salty meat provided contrast. This preparation appeared at Sunday dinners when something refined was called for. It showed that simple ingredients could be elevated through technique without adding expense. Children who normally refused plain cabbage cleaned their plates when served this way. Corned beef with creamed cabbage was comfort food dressed up for company.
Cornbread-topped beef pie was the kind of dish that made an ordinary evening feel special, even when the ingredients were humble. Your grandparents started by browning the ground beef with onions and garlic until the mixture turned savory and fragrant. Vegetables followed, often whatever could be found in the pantry or pulled from the garden. The filling simmered into a warm, hearty base that could have stood on its own. But the cornbread batter poured over the top transformed it, baking into a golden crust that was tender on the bottom and crisp on the surface. The smell filled the house with a sense of abundance, even in hard times. Your grandparents cut generous squares, each serving carrying the perfect blend of sweet cornbread and savory beef. Cornbread-topped beef pie proved that simple ingredients, handled with care, could feel like a celebration.
Corned beef and cabbage stew was the kind of one-pot meal that simmered all afternoon, filling the house with anticipation. Chunks of corned beef were browned first for extra flavor, then covered with water and simmered with cabbage wedges, potatoes, carrots, and onions until fork tender. The broth thickened naturally from the starches in the potatoes, creating gravy that clung to every piece. Families served it in deep bowls with plenty of bread for soaking. The stew was especially popular during winter months when something warm and substantial was needed to fight the cold. It could feed a crowd and tasted even better the second day when the flavors had deepened overnight. Corned beef and cabbage stew was honest food, unpretentious but deeply satisfying and always welcome.
Creole ground beef and rice bake was the sort of meal your grandparents turned to when they wanted something bold, comforting, and steady enough to feed a full table without spending much at all. It always started with ground beef in a deep pan, blended with onions, celery, and green bell pepper, the holy trinity that shaped countless Southern and Gulf Coast suppers. As the vegetables softened, they melted into the meat, releasing a fragrance that wrapped through the kitchen like memory. Tomatoes, garlic, and a touch of hot sauce followed, giving the dish its quiet heat. The rice was cooked separately, then folded in so it could absorb the seasoned juices before everything baked together. Families loved this meal because it fed many and filled the house with a smell that made the day feel easier. Your grandparents seasoned it by instinct, adding a pinch more spice or a splash more sauce depending on who was coming to dinner. Creole ground beef and rice bake was comfort built from tradition and adapted through necessity, a dish that fed both body and memory.
Corned beef and cabbage soup was the kind of dish that stretched a little into a lot, feeding large families on cold winter evenings when warmth mattered as much as flavor. The broth was built from bones and trimmings of corned beef, simmered for hours with bay leaves, peppercorns, and onion until it developed rich depth. Chunks of tender corned beef joined wedges of cabbage, carrots, and potatoes, creating a soup hearty enough to serve as a complete meal. Families ladled it into deep bowls and served it with thick slices of cornbread for soaking up every drop. The soup could be reheated for days, improving each time. It represented the wisdom of making one piece of meat feed a family for an entire week, stretching resources without sacrificing satisfaction.
Ground beef and cabbage skillet was a meal your grandparents depended on when they needed to stretch a little meat across many plates. It started with browning the beef until it released enough flavor to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the cabbage, shredded into ribbons that always cooked down into something tender and sweet. As it wilted, it mingled with the beef juices, creating a broth that needed no fancy seasoning to taste full. Some families added vinegar for brightness, others stirred in tomatoes for depth, and many added rice or noodles when they needed the meal to go further. The dish simmered until everything melded together, turning into a comforting supper that filled plates without emptying pockets. Meals like this kept families steady through decades of hardship, proving that hearty food did not require wealth, only patience and a sure hand at the stove. Ground beef and cabbage skillet was survival and comfort woven into one dish.
Corned beef cabbage rolls were a Sunday specialty that required patience but delivered comfort worth every minute of preparation. Large cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around a filling of shredded corned beef mixed with rice, onions, and seasonings. The rolls were nestled in a baking dish covered with tomato sauce and baked slowly until the cabbage became silky. The tomato sauce caramelized at the edges, adding sweetness that balanced the salty meat. These rolls appeared at church suppers and family dinners, where they were greeted with appreciation for the effort they represented. Children learned to make them by watching their mothers carefully wrap each roll. Corned beef cabbage rolls showed how one cut of meat could be transformed through care into something elegant.
Church basement sloppy joes were the heart of community gatherings, the kind of meal that fed dozens and still tasted like something made with love. The recipe began with ground beef browned in a wide skillet, then mixed with onions cooked until soft and fragrant. Tomato sauce, vinegar, mustard, and brown sugar followed, each added with instinct learned over time. As the mixture simmered, it thickened into a sauce that clung to every crumbled piece of meat. In church basements and community halls, long tables waited for families to gather. Children lined up with paper plates, adults poured sweet tea, and the smell drifted through the room like a warm invitation. These sandwiches were messy, but no one cared. They symbolized generosity and the kind of cooking that made people feel welcome. Your grandparents stirred huge pots with wooden spoons nearly as old as the building itself. No one left hungry, and no one left feeling alone. Church basement sloppy joes fed more than bodies. They fed connection.
Corned beef and cabbage casserole was the dish that turned leftovers into company food, layered and baked until bubbly and golden. Sliced corned beef lined the bottom of a buttered baking dish, covered with a layer of sautéed cabbage, then topped with creamy mashed potatoes. Some families added cheese for extra richness. The casserole baked until the edges crisped and the layers melded together into something greater than their parts. It was made for potlucks and church suppers where it traveled well and served easily. The presentation elevated humble ingredients into something impressive. Children often preferred the casserole to boiled dinner because of the crispy edges and creamy texture. Corned beef and cabbage casserole represented the transformation of necessity into celebration.
Skillet hamburger hash with potatoes was the kind of meal your grandparents leaned on when the day had already taken every ounce of their energy, but the family still needed something warm and filling before bedtime. It always began with ground beef sizzling in a cast iron pan, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions that followed. Then came the diced potatoes, piled high at first, slowly sinking into the pan as the heat worked its way through them. Those potatoes were the real secret, stretching the meat further and soaking up every bit of seasoning until they tasted richer than they had any right to be. Your grandparents learned to flip the potatoes at just the right moment, leaving some edges crisp while letting the centers turn tender and soft.
Corned beef and cabbage with black-eyed peas was a fusion dish that married Irish-American tradition with African-American soul food staples. The corned beef was sliced thin and layered over simmered black-eyed peas cooked with onions, garlic, and ham hock for smokiness. Shredded cabbage was wilted in the potlikker from the peas, absorbing that earthy, savory flavor. The combination provided complete protein and stretched the meat further than it could go alone. Families served this, especially on New Year's Day when black-eyed peas symbolized luck. The salty corned beef played beautifully against the creamy peas and tender cabbage. It was a dish born of necessity and cultural blending that became beloved in its own right. This combination showed how African American cooks transformed ingredients into something uniquely their own. Those kitchens are quiet now. Like and subscribe if one of these dishes brought someone back.